Today I'm going to discuss the topic of pheromones, what are pheromones exactly, if not the cause of attraction. And when you look at pheromones, we predominantly think of them as, for example, the smell of a particular individual. I'm going to take away from that particular perspective, because if we were to simply approach at pheromones or to pheromones through just the idea that pheromones are just a chemical enzyme, then we will only approach pheromones through the pattern of them being chemical enzymes, where I will be approaching pheromones through the understanding of behavior, because in my personal opinion, pheromones are a behavior stimulus. Now, in order to understand behavior, we also have to understand and break down the concept between alpha and beta. And in order to do so, we have to label what causes an alpha to be an alpha and what causes a beta to be a beta. When we look specifically in studies of all life forms, what causes or is labeled as an alpha? Throughout all life forms, what we label as an alpha is simply an individual who has an inability to feel anxiety. If you as an individual experience anxiety, you are not an alpha. That is the predominant definition of what an alpha is, which results in you now being labeled as a beta. What do betas often see alphas as a threat to them, where now we begin to see the predator-prey stance, which we also can indicate through the narcissist and empath pathologies. Now, when we identify an alpha, they're typically more dominating in stance, which is what creates a narcissist, a dominating person, which seeks to dominate the prey in essence, correct? However, simply because a person is dominating doesn't necessarily mean they are a negative type of narcissist, because I would argue that there are positive types of narcissists. It is simply according to the state of self-awareness that an individual has that causes them to know how to control the aspects of life that which have caused them pain previously, and control the factors of those pains in order to prevent themselves from experiencing those particular functions. Now, when we look at the study or field of study, such as evolutionary psychology, sexual reproduction, or even something as simple as something like basic biology, as well as physiology. When we look at these concepts, we find one particular truth, that for a man, he must assert or insert himself, and for a woman, she must intake or submit to the man that is seeking to enter, resulting in a dominant and submissive state, which when we analyze the idea behind sexual chemistry, or not just sexual chemistry, but something as simple as attraction, which results in the behavior matching of individuals. In the behavior matching, we have to understand a certain concept, which is that thoughts become words, words become actions, actions become patterns, patterns become behavior, and behavior becomes reality. And if we now bring it back to the initial purpose of thought, where does one experience anxiety? In their thoughts. And if you're simply afraid of your thoughts, you're definitely not an alpha. But let's trace back now in the idea that in my perception or understanding of pheromones, I would argue that pheromones are the behavior of the individual, which can be traced back from behavior to patterns, to actions, to words, to thought. And these all correlate back into who you are as a person and how you choose to present yourself. But if we were to look now at specifically identifying pheromones as just a chemical enzyme, let's dive into that then. Okay, say pheromones are just a chemical enzyme which dictate your level of attraction. In the field of study of evolutionary process or evolutionary psychology, sexual attraction and sexual selection. If you were to look at the studies predominantly studying the effects of birth control, you would find that women on birth control select more feminine men compared to women on their natural cycling process prefer masculine men. In the understanding of selecting more feminine men, it dictates particularly to the features of a man. But they're not just the physical features, because if a man is simply just physical features, for the lack of a better word, then as a woman you would understand how just being seen as physical features has a negative impact on your life, because you are more than just a body. You're also a mind, you're also a spirit. Which, if we simply look at this field of study as a selective of less masculine features, we're not just talking about the body, we're also talking about their behavior. Alpha and beta, which alpha stems typically towards more masculine men, and betas typically stem towards more feminine men in their entire being, not just physically. And now when we look at the predominant factor behind what causes this source of attraction now to more feminine men compared to the initial masculinity of man, the only differentiating state is birth control given to women. Which, if women are on birth control, they will choose beta men, they will choose feminine men. And women that are on their natural selection of their natural cycle, they will always lean and choose to have masculine men as their partners. But how does this affect you as a woman in your choosing of your partners, as well as the lifespan of your relationships, and as well as the termination of your marriages? When you look at the effects of birth control having not just physically but psychologically on women, you choose now more feminine men. But what happens when, say, you do want to create a child or an offspring with that man? You go off the birth control. But what happens when you go off the birth control? Well, if you've been in a relationship for, say, 3 years while on birth control, all of a sudden, the moment you come off birth control and you're now fertile, not only will you be now more attracted towards masculine men, you will also seek or see a disapproval in your current partner, which will cause you to terminate your relationship with that particular individual, whether that be a short-term relationship or a long-term relationship such as a marriage, which if you are entering a true relationship and are seeking to actually settle, as a woman, I would invite you to specifically get off the birth control pill or contraceptives. Because if you're entering your approach and finding your forever, you will have a different perception of what that forever is going to look like initially, because you will be choosing a more beta or feminine person as your partner. And the moment you choose then to want to conceive, what do? You hop off the contraceptive. You stop taking the pill. And once you stop taking the pill, you now see you are no longer attracted to the beta. You are no longer attracted to the feminine partner. You will now seek a more masculine or alpha person to be your partner. What has caused or been the rise of disruption in marriages, or specifically you could say divorce? Predominantly women are responsible for divorce rates being at the 60 to 70% divorce rates we now experience in today's world. What do you think is a leading factor behind the high divorce rates we experience in our world today? Up until the sexual revolution of women, or the creation of feminism, which allowed women to now no longer have problems the moment they choose to have sex. Back in the 1970s or early 1980s was the creation of birth control, which was meant to liberate women to become equal to men. But now when you analyze this particular pattern, you will see that this exact moment in time is where we also saw a change in gender roles between men and women. And if the gender roles of men and women have shifted or completely changed, it is not because of one particular thing other than birth control. Birth control caused women to now see themselves, and I'm not saying women are not equal, but they simply gained the equal level playing field of sexual proclivity. And in the equal sexual proclivity, where you're now no longer always condemned every time you have sex to now birth an offspring, you no longer had the responsibility of being condemned with an offspring. So you were now always free to go about. This opened women's sexual liberation. It allowed women to have sex with whoever they wanted, whenever they wanted, without having to be responsible for getting pregnant. But in this particular moment, we saw a drastic change in society as well, because we now saw a more liberal perspective of society, where now we see that not in just pursuing equality for women, we also changed the gender roles in order to benefit women. Men were no longer men because women were choosing more feminine men. And the moment a woman stops taking birth control, she now seeks a more masculine man to be her driving force. Which now when we look at specifically the idea that a woman likes to be submissive and she likes a dominating man, typically relating to sexual activity. Women don't like men that don't know what they're doing. Because in the pheromone of the attraction also creates the pheromone of the peak of the attraction, which is also called the orgasm, the orgasmic peak. If a man doesn't have control over your orgasms as a woman, you typically don't like that man. You say, he was good, not that good. Because it takes a driving dominance that builds the experience, which what is a pheromone? It's a behavior that builds the level of attraction that ultimately results in you as a woman experiencing orgasmic pleasure. The moment a woman hops on birth control, they now sought more feminine men, beta males, more submissive men, and women became more dominating. And in the idea that women are now more dominating, guess what? The man no longer knows how to please you sexually. And if you were to now specifically correlate these things together, you would realize that how do you solve not just marriage succession, evolutionary processes, sexual relations, as well as something as simple as just basic attraction? How do you solve these particular things? Well, I would invite you as a woman, I'm not going to tell you stop taking your pill because I'm not your doctor. I'm not the person specifically prescribing it to you. All I'm saying is if you want to have a happy marriage where you have the actual partner you choose to want to have, you need to enter that relationship free of a chemical limiting factor, being a contraceptive. If you enter a relationship while on a contraceptive, chances are that relationship is not going to last.